Hi everyone, welcome to the second session of Bold Innovates community building program. As you know, one of Bold Innovates goals is to bring a community together in life science and health. Such community who will get together to discuss hard and sometimes what we call complicated topics in life science and health. And we call this Bold Get Together. One of Bold Innovates community building programs is Life Sciences and Health Stakeholders Connected series, and we're actually kicking off the first one today. In this series, our priority is to focus on connecting life science and health stakeholders in an open and safe place to discuss gaps in life science and health. Reflecting this, we are today focusing on a topic which for a long time was overlooked, clinical trial transparency. And we are hosting Till Bruckner, who is the founder of an important initiative called TranspariMED, which is an organization working to end evidence distortion in medicine. I would like to welcome Till. Hi, Till. Welcome to the session.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very nice to have you in this session for sure. And for everyone who is joining us today, feel free to make comments on the live chat, ask questions, and they will be addressed at the end of the session. I would like to also give you a brief intro on the agenda. First 20-25 minutes or so, Till will give us a very interesting presentation on the pillars of clinical trial transparency. And the last half an hour, we will be having an open discussion and have some questions for each other, I'm sure, to discuss the guideline they wrote for policymakers on clinical trials. So I think we can now kick off the session with Till, your presentation. Feel free to also give an introduction to yourself and what you do, and then start the presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. I've been working in clinical trial transparency for the last 5 years or so. I set up a campaign called TranspariMED. We collaborate with organizations including Cochrane, Transparency International, and the idea really is to improve the transparency of clinical trials. So as Melon just said, I'll just give a quick presentation, a quick overview of where we're at, and then we can have a conversation. And if you got any questions, just stick them in the window and we can cover those in a second. Does this visual work for you now? Quick check.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll just be talking about where we're at in clinical trial transparency, why it matters, and what comes next. You know, what does the future look like? And I think it's a really important topic for everyone who's involved in medical research. Because we got a problem, we got a massive problem here. And this is a classic study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2008. And it compared what information the FDA had access to and what information doctors in the medical literature had access to on clinical trials of 12 antidepressant drugs that were already on the market. So on the left side, you can see that there were 74 clinical trials in total, and the green ones were the ones that had a positive outcome that suggested, okay, this medication does more harm than good. And the red ones were the ones that were ambiguous or negative, which basically concluded, okay, this medicine is not worth taking. And if you look at how that translated into the medical literature, you only had 52 of those trials published, and the overwhelming majority of them were presented in a positive light. So only 3 studies of all these medicines were published that suggested that, you know, maybe they don't do something useful for patients. And there's a huge literature on this. This is an example of a study by Ben Goldacre, who found that only 9 trials out of 67 published in the top 5 medical journals reported their outcomes as originally pre-specified. So with all of the others, there were gaps and shifts there. Another one showing that, and this covered 300 clinical trials, was that adverse events were only completely reported in 11 publications. Then you have a lot of clinical trials whose results never get made public at all. In this case, it was 455 trials involving children, and nearly 100 of those had never made their results public. That's tens of thousands of trial participants whose investment of time and energy really has been wasted. Then you have even drugs that are on the market. You can't always see the results of the clinical trials. So what are health technology assessment agencies meant to do with that? How are they meant to evaluate those medicines? And here we got adverse events again, where you got 198 deaths recorded in clinical trials, but only 29 deaths reported in journals. So I think as a community, yes, we do have a massive problem. And how do we move forward? And together with Cochrane and Transparency International, we just developed 5 basic pillars of clinical trial transparency. And from the left, that's clinical trial registration. So you register a trial before it starts. You post the results of that trial onto the trial registry within 12 months of the trial finishing. Full trial reports, usually clinical study reports, are proactively disclosed. Then you've got academic publication in medical journals, and then you've got data sharing. And today I'm only going to talk about 2 of those, the most simple ones. And the first one is trial registration. This is incredibly valuable because it gives you an overview of all research that's happening worldwide. So, for example, if you're looking at COVID studies of potential COVID treatments, repurposed drugs, if you have complete clinical trial registration, you can see at a glance who is running trials on hydroxychloroquine, who is running trials on corticosteroids, who's running trials on convalescent blood plasma, what are their outcome measures, what are their recruitment targets, when do they expect to finish? And you can think, is it really necessary to do another trial on this? Or should I change the design of my trial so that it's comparable with them? Are we filling a gap here? What it does from an integrity point of view is once it's registered, it stays up there. So trials can't be disappeared afterwards. If, for example, a company or an academic investigator doesn't like the results, well, you can still see that they ran the trial and you can still ask them about that. And it disincentivizes the kind of outcome switching where your trial fails on the primary outcome, but then you publish it in a journal, just citing like the great results you got on a secondary outcome without mentioning that fact. So it's a really strong integrity safeguard. And then you've got the summary results posting on trial registries. Of course, you should also put trial results into medical journals, but registries have got 2 massive advantages. And the first one is that it's much faster. You don't have to wait for journal editors to decide whether or not they're going to publish this. You don't have to wait for peer review. You don't get rejected by 4 journals so that you have to run from one journal to the next. You can put the results up there in a format that's internationally recognized at a timeline of your choice. And several studies show that results posted onto registries are also more accurate than results that were reported in journals. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has put out a statement. It's very clear. No journal is going to reject your publication if you've just briefly summarized the result on a trial registry before. So this does not endanger publication. You can put it up there straight away, and then you can think about journal publication. So what are the rules around this? Well, for pre-registering all trials, incredibly strong framework. I mean, you've got the World Health Organization putting out a joint statement on trial registration and reporting. You've got the Declaration of Helsinki, which covers ethics in medical research. And in a lot of countries, you've got national rules. I think this is just a global expectation now. You register the trial before the first participant receives the first intervention. Ideally, you register the trial immediately after ethics approval, before you even start recruiting. I mean, just get it done. The second one is putting trial results on registries within 12 months of trial completion. Again, it's a very clear World Health Organization best practice. It's also a regulatory requirement in the European Union, and it is a legal requirement in the US for some trials. And in addition, some funding agencies like The Wellcome Trust, for example, they also expect you to do this. And if you don't do it, they will follow up with you and you might not get funding from them in the future. So again, this is something that is rapidly turning into sort of global standard operating procedure. And if you think about how urgent it felt to get all those COVID trial results last year, everyone was like, oh my God, when's the readout for that trial? When's the readout for that trial? Well, that's what a lot of cancer patients feel like every day. But somehow, until recently, it was acceptable that they had to wait for 2, 3, 4 years until the results came out. And thanks to trial registries, we can cut down that time. We can accelerate medical research. We can be transparent, even if a journal is being very, very slow. So as campaigners, as campaign groups, what do we want? And it's really simple. We just want what the World Health Organization wants. And that's essentially clinical trial sponsors. So that's pharmaceutical companies, but also universities and hospitals should set and enforce these two simple rules, pre-register your trial and put the results up on a registry within 12 months. The same thing for funding agencies, and I said there's already movement in that. There's movement with the Wellcome Trust, National Institute for Health Research. A lot of the largest funders worldwide now have committed to this, and they're starting to monitor compliance and they're enforcing the rules. And then, of course, national governments and regulators also. Just set and enforce these simple rules. And as I said, these rules are already in place for some clinical trials in the European Union and in the US. So there's been a lot of progress on this. And I think this is a one-way street, We are going to see this globally. The only question is this going to take 2 years, or is it going to take 5 years, or is it going to take 50 years? So let's look at progress now. And in the United States, this is only for legal requirements. So this is the data I'm about to show is only for clinical trials that are legally compelled to make their results public within 12 months on clinicaltrials.gov. And there's an online tracking tool that you can check out called the FDA Trials Tracker, named after the US law. And it found that 3/4 of trials now do comply with this rule. So you can find results for 3/4 of trials that should have results for them up on clinicaltrials.gov. Still missing for 1/4 of trials, but it's a substantial improvement. I think reporting performance has gone up from about 55% to 75% only over the past few years. And if you look at the biggest players in the field, they're doing remarkably well. These are the sponsors in the US with the largest volume of trials subject to the law. So you got MD Anderson Cancer Center, nonprofit. They've got a reporting rate of 100%. National Cancer Institute, 98%. If you see something like 98%, it means that they're probably late with a couple of trials, but they are consistently doing it. Novartis, 98%. This is great. Massachusetts General Hospital, 86%. No, that is not convincing. That really doesn't hit the mark. But in general, the large sponsors are really performing brilliantly in the US. So let's look at it in the EU. And again, these data are only for clinical trials of investigative medicinal products where there is a regulatory obligation to make the results public within 12 months. Again, there's a tracker for this online. It's called the EU Trials Tracker, developed by the same team at the University of Oxford in the UK. You can check it out. It gets updated at least once a month. And we see a similar compliance rate in the European Union. We've got 76.5% of trial results that should be up there are up there now. And that's increased from only 50% 3 years ago. So over the past 3 years, we've seen like a huge surge in improved trial reporting across the European Union. And when we look at the largest players, we get a very similar picture. You can see there on top with the most trials is Novartis, 100% reporting rate. GlaxoSmithKline, 100%. Pfizer, 99%. Again, they're probably late on 1 or 2 trials. Merck Sharp and Dohme, 100%. So that is really the norm. You get some exceptions there. You can see Hospitals of Paris, APHP, they've only got a reporting rate of 7.7%. It's not as bad as it looks, because they've improved from 3% in recent months. So they're also starting to tackle this now. They're just far behind the curve. But you can see that other non-profit sponsors like the Medical University of Vienna and KU Leuven, who are like among the top 3 non-commercial trial sponsors, they've also got reporting rates over 90%. And the only reason why they're not on 100% is because they only started this process 2 or 3 years ago. So they're rapidly catching up. We're seeing this across all major players in Europe. So what's the progress on trials that aren't covered by EU regulations and by US law? And the answer is we don't really know. We don't have a comprehensive overview. The best data we've got comes from a large German study which looked at every single clinical trial that wasn't a drug trial, sponsored by German universities over a period of several years. And then they ran exhaustive literature searches to find the results of those trials. They looked through trial registries. And what they found was that 28% of those clinical trials had never made their results public. It was over 50,000 patients participated in those trials. So we've got a huge gap in the evidence base there. We don't know what happened with those trials. Were they successful? Were they not successful? What were the adverse events? What happened to the various subgroups in them? You know, were the trials terminated early, but they didn't mark it in the registry? We simply don't know. And that's incredibly irresponsible, and it makes life terribly difficult for systematic reviewers and for meta-analysts. If you're trying to get together all the medicine, all the evidence base on a medicine or on a medical device, and 28% of the evidence is missing, you know, and it's borderline, does this help patients or not? You know, you just got to throw up your hands in the air and say, well, we can't evaluate that. This really shouldn't happen, but it still happens, sadly. And when we look at other regions outside the EU and the US, again, we simply don't know. There hasn't been enough research into this. We're now living in a world where over half of the COVID vaccines that have been taken by people worldwide have been produced in either China or Russia. But if you look at the literature on clinical trial reporting, if you look at the studies done, they all tend to focus on the US, on Canada, on the EU, on Australia, on the UK. And I think that is something where, as a community, we really need to start asking, you know, what is happening in these other countries? And, you know, sometimes it might be that they've got some systems in place that are better than ours. I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from China, from India, from other places, but people just haven't looked. And that's a really big gap in the knowledge bases. But we do know that in dozens of countries, there is some kind of regulation or legislation about clinical trial registration or reporting. The question is just, are they enforcing it? Are people sticking to it? And when we look to the future, I think the best model we have is the Make It Public strategy from the United Kingdom, Great Britain. And this is absolutely fantastic. This is what happens when politicians sit together and say, we are going to solve the problem. So on the left, you see the normal flow of a clinical trial. So you got the trial design, you got the ethics approval, you got the trial registration, and then you've got the recruitment and the conduct of the trial, and the evaluating of the data. And then at the end, you got the results reporting. And we know that with trial registration and with results reporting, there have been gaps in the past. So here's what they're going to do in the UK. And this is going to start in January 2022. So after ethics approval, they're going to centrally archive all ethics approvals in the country for clinical trials with the Health Research Authority in London. So basically, once a trial gets ethics approval, and that's a system that every trial must run through, it's going to go in a cellar in the Health Research Authority, so they know what's been approved. The next step is that the Health Research Authority itself will automatically register the trial for you on a trial registry. So if you're a company or if you're an academic researcher, this actually saves you a lot of work, because there is one person, it's probably just one person, maybe just part-time, at a central government agency who's doing this work for you, but who's also ensuring that 100% of clinical trials get pre-registered. And then after the result has been finished, the Health Research Authority looks through its archive and it checks if the results have been reported. They'll check in the trial registry, they'll check in the literature, and if the results haven't been reported, they'll send out an email reminder, and then they'll send out another email reminder, and at some point in the future, they will also impose sanctions. And I think this is great. I think this is an illustration of how you have a really seemingly really complex problem that can actually be solved quite easily. And the beautiful thing about the UK model is that the Make It Public strategy is built around three principles. And, one is make information public. Okay, no surprises there. It is a transparency strategy. But the other ones are make transparency easy and make transparency the norm. In future, if you run a clinical trial in the UK, you will find that actually the red tape you have to stumble through, including ethics approval, regulatory approval, all these things have been streamlined. If there's government funding for the trial, for National Institute of Health Research or Medical Research Council, that's also getting integrated into the system. As a trial sponsor, as an investigator, you will have much less bureaucracy, you will have much less red tape, but at the same time, just by going through the normal process, which is very well explained as well, which helps, you will achieve a high degree of clinical trial transparency. And I think that's the future, because that's just a model where everyone wins. So thank you for your time. If you want to have a look at the studies that I was talking about in this presentation, you can find it in Clinical Trial Transparency, a guide for policymakers. It's up on the TranspariMED website. And on the website also, you can find a lot of blogs just updating, what are the new rules, what are the new regulations, which new studies have been done in that area. And by all means, if you've got any questions after this webinar, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thanks, Till, for that very interesting presentation. I also noted down so many questions already upon it. And for our audience, we also dropped the link for you on the document that Till was mentioning on clinical trial transparency, a guide for policymakers. So feel free to click through and download. Till, thanks a lot. Where to start? Because I think I'm especially interested to hear more about the UK model, because I guess that if that goes through successfully, then it can be phenocopied to other countries and make it global. And perhaps the first question from my side would be on the model actually, and your thoughts on how do you view UK model integrating with kind of collaborating with other countries, or is it just going to start in the UK, focus on the UK data, and then see if it can expand to other geographies, or stay local?
Yeah, I mean, this is very clearly a national model. You can't expand that to other countries because ethics approvals are often seen as confidential, because there might be some things in there about the clinical trial design or other things that can't be made public. So I don't think it would be realistic to expect ethics committees in France to sort of share that information with the UK system. I think it's something that national governments everywhere should be aiming at doing, and I think it's very feasible. I mean, national governments do things like track the insurance of millions of motor vehicles. They track health insurance for millions of people. You can't tell me that they can't track a few thousand trials. I mean, it's just a question of political will. And if you look at data like, 28% of clinical trials with tens of thousands of participants never make their results public, how much is that costing the taxpayer? How many times as well, for companies that are trying out like a new approach to a disease, are they running down a blind alley because they don't even know it, because a rival company hasn't made the clinical trial results public that show that actually this is an avenue not pursuing? So I think there's a lot of efficiency gains to be had there. The overall cost of the UK strategy is probably less than £1 million, which is around €1 million. I mean, this is peanuts for a government.
Yeah, and
It's
also if we look at look at the cost of not registering trials globally, it's around, I think you also have it in the report, around $38 billion, around that, or was it 68? I can't remember right now, but it's huge cost, and when you consider that it's minuscule to share and build up such strategy. My thought there is that it's great to have local models, but what also COVID-19 pandemic showed us is that we need standardized way of going through all these pillars of clinical trial transparency. That's why my personal opinion there is that can we build something locally that could be standardized and become more globally used? Because otherwise we will again do separately on different countries, and then maybe repeat and tailor it to geography specific needs, and then unable to maybe standardize the data, like you said, for the systematic reviewers, meta-analysts, etc. So what is your view on that? I mean, I completely advocate of building new models, and I think the UK model looks fantastic. The question is, how do we build models that are standardized across the entire globe? Because it looks like the future will have more pandemics and more infectious diseases, and we will need that standardization. What are your thoughts in moving in that direction, or the speed that we're in?
Well, I mean, thank you for cheering us all up with the more pandemics and more infectious diseases. Um, we've got that system already. We've got national trial registries like clinicaltrials.gov in the US. We've got the EU drug trial registry. We've got registries in China, in India. We've got a Pan-African clinical trial registry, and all of these registries have the same basic core data sets. And the data from all of those registries is already being pulled together by the World Health Organization in the ICTRP trial registry. So we have that. That's not the problem. We've got the basic infrastructure there. The problem is, what happens if you've got the infrastructure, but some people forget to register their trials? What happens if we got the infrastructure, but the results aren't put up there? And if you look, for example, at Cochrane reviews, I mean, the amount of time that is wasted every day around the world by people looking for studies based on clinical trials of medication A in condition B. It's absolutely insane in the 21st century that we've got all these highly qualified people really wasting their time going through multiple search strategies, etc., when all the results should simply be in one place globally. The infrastructure is there. It's not the problem. The problem is getting people to just consistently use that infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that indeed the compliance is a big issue. And what I was thinking also during our presentation is that we've seen great progress by the pharmaceutical companies over the years, especially after 2007, 2008, with a lot of campaigns. We do see a great progress, and the question that is maybe that comes to mind is that why are not all doing it, and some maybe pharmaceutical companies are doing it only? Is it lack of training? Is it lack of awareness? Do scientists maybe know the impacts of not doing or complying, or what do you think the main reasons are that are causing this non-compliance across all pharmaceutical companies?
Well, I think it's a lack of awareness. I mean, if you look at a large pharmaceutical company these days, they're going to have a separate regulatory compliance division that is staffed by people who are expert to the dot in all the rules and regulations in all the countries where they're running clinical trials. So, a company like Pfizer or GSK, they will have a whole department that is dedicated towards making sure that these rules are followed and that these laws are respected, and that's been really, really successful. If you're a small startup, you can't afford that sort of expertise. And, you might just overlook it. You might just forget to register the clinical trial on time. And then you get the readout from the clinical trial. And then you think, wow, this is amazing, and you try and get it published in the BMJ, and the BMJ says, well, no, sorry, you didn't pre-register that trial. We're not going to publish it. And then you go to, JAMA, and they'll say, well, sorry, we've got this policy. We're not going to publish it because it wasn't pre-registered. And then you can say, oh, but I only registered it 3 days late. They don't care. They won't publish it. And then further on, you submit that as a phase 2 trial as part of a regulatory submission package. And then the FDA is going to say, well, we're not even going to consider that data because the trial wasn't pre-registered. And that's, I think, when it starts blowing up in your face. And that's when you realize that actually this was quite important. But sadly, in the early days, you didn't think about it. And I mean, we're having that problem in academia now where people just can't get papers published in respectable journals because they just dropped the ball on clinical trial registration. And I mean, yeah, you do that once and you've learned the lesson, but that's not how things are meant to work. What you really want is a system like the UK that just automatically steers people onto a path where they automatically do the right thing.
Exactly, and as you said, with smaller companies, it's also the matter of time because they're always on a very kind of a fast train, on a roller coaster ride, trying to get the investment in and push the R&D forward. And I think most of the time it is because it looks so much of a hassle for them. Some of them do comply, but it should be a global norm, like you mentioned as well, and it should be standardized and universally accepted. And I think we did make progress, but there's still a long way, I think, to go. And that leads me to my, second kind of topic in mind, question in mind, that there's also perhaps an awareness of the cost of not registering trials, right, by different stakeholders, perhaps. Can you touch base a little bit on that as well, especially when you look at the startup investors or young biotechs? If we look at from their angle, what are the costs of not registering trials for investors, for example?
Well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I think, if you tell investors, oh, we've got this really exciting phase 2 trial in the pipeline, and then they check it out on clinicaltrials.gov, which they will if they're a smart investor, and they realize that you only registered it 2 weeks after it started, they'll be thinking, well, actually that data you're generating can't be used for a marketing application. So you'll have to rerun that entire trial in order to get regulators to even look at the thing, so that can really blow up in your face. Another thing is, say you've run 10 clinical trials already, and the exciting positive ones, you publish them in a journal and maybe also in the trial registry, and the other 4, oh well, so why should we make them public, etc. And then an investor comes along and says, oh yeah, well, you say you've got like this really exciting product pipeline, but I don't know what happened in those 4 trials. I mean, I'm not gonna buy a company whose value depends on me trusting them when they say that those trial results were just not very exciting, because who knows what happened in those trials. I mean, maybe there were a lot of adverse events, maybe they completely contradicted what the positive trials said, maybe there's like some huge lawsuits lurking in the background. Once you go to market, if clinical trial results weren't shared, there's cases where pharmaceutical companies have literally had to pay out billions, where part of the lawsuit case was that they hadn't made all data from their clinical trials public. And then when people start suffering adverse events, that is something that the lawyers will be looking into. So you've got a lot of legal liability that you might be buying along with the company. Then you also got the reputational thing. Do you really want to be involved with a company that is blatantly breaking the law, where you can even look on something like the EU trials track and you can see that it's breaking the law? I mean, is that really someone who you want to be associating with? So yeah, I think there's from an investor perspective, you want to invest in a company that really dots the T's, crosses the T's and dots the I's. You don't want to take risk with a company that gets these really basic things wrong, because if they're getting that wrong, how can you trust them that they're running their clinical trials properly? Because that's 100 times more complex, Once they hand in like these thousands of pages to the FDA or to the European Medicines Agency, who are going to go through that with a like really fine comb, what other problems are they going to find if you didn't even get the basics right? And I think that's something that investors are going to be looking at, And I think there's also a thing with large institutional investors. The All Trials campaign about 6 or 7 years ago, they got together a coalition of global investment funds with, I don't know, they had combined assets of $100 billion or something like that. These were really big, serious players, and they called for clinical trial transparency, because when they invested in companies, they wanted to know what they're buying, and they wanted to know what the risks are and what the potential benefits are. They didn't want to find about that in court 3 years later. So I think it's pretty standard now, this disclosure. It's just something that small companies often overlook. And my experience is that when sometimes I spot a company that isn't doing well, a small company, and I'll contact them on Twitter and I say, hey, you're actually breaking the law here. Can you please fix this? And then I check a month or 2 months later and they fixed it. So the question is, why is this left to like one guy on Twitter, operating on a shoestring on his laptop to remind people to please be so kind and follow the law? I mean, what are regulators doing here? Because there is clearly goodwill by these people. There's not some sort of sinister agenda where they're trying to hide things. They're very prepared to do the right thing. But why is it that, some random researcher has to go on Twitter? Why aren't regulators just sending them letters and emails, just saying, okay, your clinical trial results are coming due in 1 month. Please remember to put them up. Your clinical trial reviews came due yesterday. You've got 1 month to put them up now. And it's like these basic things are really missing in the system. And I think it's wrong to go and blame small companies for this when they overlook that, because he said, they're running from one investor to the next, they're on this wild roller coaster. I mean, regulators should be really enabling this and not waiting sort of issues to pile up that later blow up in the company's face. Because say you're running like this really successful phase 2 trial, but you didn't get the registration right. I mean, it's not just the company and the investors that suffer, it's also patients that suffer. If it's a great product and you need to take another 2 years then, to bring the thing to market, I mean, that's not okay for patients. So more and more of the work that we're doing is actually pushing regulators, and along the UK model of, make this routine, make it easy for
Make
people.
it easy.
Give them the guides, make it easy, make it the norm, make it part of just the standard way in which business is done. And with the UK strategy, I should add, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, they just put out a policy paper a couple of weeks ago, setting out their wish list, what they'd like from the UK government, including more money, of course. And one of the things that they asked for was for the government to fully implement this strategy. So we've got full industry buy-in into here in the UK. And in the US, the large companies originally opposed clinical trial transparency. By now, they're all following the rules. They've got nothing to fear from this legislation, and they've stopped pushing back against it. It's just the world has changed, and it's just become the new normal.
Yeah, and open science will be pursued more and more going forward, I think. I think the reason also that a lot of companies, because as you said, a lot of these companies want to do really well and good for the patients, and especially the scientists. They come from great education and they want to be innovative. They want to build great innovations. There's no bad agenda here, and regulators should make it easy for them, surely. So we should maybe also think of systems to help regulators to make the whole process less manual maybe. So look at digital solutions, automation solutions, maybe automated reminders to each and every company that is running a trial, for example. So I think if we keep raising these issues, eventually the digital innovations will perhaps also start to have new innovations, new technologies for the regulators. And I know that there are a few going really well, digital solutions, but it is also lagging a bit behind as a sector, I think, to help regulators automate with digital solutions. So it's very interesting, and it's nice to see the progress as well. And I completely agree with you that making it easy part will kind of also take a bit of load off, right? Everyone's shoulders a bit, because it is hard. And like the Twitter example, it's completely coincidental that someone goes on Twitter and sees that company that is breaking the law, and it is completely at your discretion to warn. So hopefully it will become more automated. Another question that I have is how you view the difference between academia and industry in terms of progress in clinical trial registration, say the last decade. How do you think it has evolved?
Well, I mean, like I said, in the large pharmaceutical companies, they've got their compliance divisions, they've got their experts, they've got their internal systems where they keep on top of every clinical trial. And as a result of that, they're doing really well. If you're looking at a typical large university, each professor, it's a bit like medieval Europe, you know. You get like all these little principalities and fiefdoms, and they're all under the same king, but day to day they do what they like, and nobody really gathers the data centrally. So the very first thing that we're encouraging universities to do is just to give someone at least a part-time job in the job description where it says keep an overview of all clinical trials that you have run and that are ongoing, and then send reminders out to people. Because in a lot of the large institutions, until very recently, there wasn't somebody like that. They didn't have the oversight of that. And then also, when you're talking about reporting results on UDRACT, on the European Trial Registry, it's actually quite complex. It's not user-friendly. If you do it in the US on clinicaltrials.gov, you've got a wonderful support team there. If you've got a problem, you send them an email, you get a response within a few hours, it's great. In Europe, the European Medicines Agency they've improved the help desk. We really pushed for that, and they were listening, and they improved the help desk, but it's still a lot slower, and the system itself is more complex. So it's not enough for a university to just email everyone and say, you have to do this, and then leave super qualified, very well paid people to spend a week puzzling about how to get the results up there. They need to support people, or they need to report the results for them. And setting up that kind of system takes quite a bit of time. But then when you've got people who are experienced with uploading results onto UDRACT and the trial design isn't particularly complex, they can upload the results in 2 or 3 hours. It's just a question of getting the systems in place. And as I said, the EU Trials Tracker only launched in 2018. And that was the sort of wake-up call for universities. And that's why, for example, APHP in France, why they're still behind, just because they started the journey later. But they're on track now. They're working to fix the problem. But with all the smaller universities and smaller companies, they're simply not on the public radar. They're not going to find themselves in a newspaper, in a TranspariMED report, simply because they're quite small fish, and we can't reach them through campaigning. I can't contact them all personally. And like you said, that's something where regulators have to come in. The European Medicines Agency has started sending out email reminders, but they found out that a lot of the emails in their database were no longer valid because people have moved jobs. It really is a case where regulators just need to up their game. For example, the Food and Drug Administration is now starting to enforce the law. They have already sent, for the last 9 months, they've been sending warning letters to trial sponsors saying, if you don't put the results up there within a month, we're going to fine you $10,000 for every single day the result is late. Magically, everyone who received a letter like that put their trial results up there straight away. But we still have something like 3,000 missing trial results in the US. So why can't the FDA, with its thousands of employees and a budget of several $billions, why can't they just send out 3,000 letters at once? They've just been faffing around, like sending 50 letters over 9 months. That's not acceptable and is not helpful. And it's also not helpful only to go to people after they've broken the rules and then say, we're giving you a deadline of 30 days or we're really going to make you pay. I mean, where's the reminder, the friendly reminder saying, hey, your results are due in 30 days. Please get on top of this. Your results are due in 2 weeks. Please get on top of this. There's just so much more that regulators could be doing in that space. And I think that's something where, as a small campaign group, yes, regulators will occasionally listen to us, but we don't carry the weight. And I hope that in future, there's going to be a lot more engagement from industry there, with industry going to regulators saying, we want you to cut a lot of red tape. We want you to make the system easier. And we want you to set up a similar thing to what's being done now in the UK. That just makes life much easier for everyone. That lowers all this crazy bureaucracy around clinical trials, but that still has all the safeguards in place that we need for patients and for public health. And I think that's the way forward.
And when obviously you are a campaigner and you interact with other NGOs, you interact with other stakeholders, why do you think the main reason is with regulators lagging behind on chasing these or enforcing some of the legislation that is in place?
Well, because they're insanely busy people who've got a lot of things to do every single day. I mean, imagine the regulator in the UK. First, they had Brexit, where suddenly, like, the whole regulatory system for medicines and medical devices was up in the air, So what's this going to look like after Brexit? Well, that depends on the Brexit deal. What's the Brexit deal going to be? We don't know, because the politicians are only going to announce that 5 minutes before midnight, at their negotiation. So they had to develop all these different, possibilities, how they could adjust to those different things. So, as soon as they'd done that, a global pandemic hit, oh my God, so now you gotta regulate all the COVID tests, you got to regulate all those vaccine trials. You've got to coordinate clinical trials, which the UK did brilliantly. And I mean, when are you going to find time to think about this? And I think that's where campaigning comes in. We try and get it into the front page of a national newspaper just to force people to just pay attention for 5 minutes, put it on the agenda of their next management meeting, and then say, okay, we've got to tackle this, and put it somewhere in their work stream so that at some point, somebody is responsible for solving this and somebody will stay on top of it. But I mean, I've developed a huge amount of respect for regulators, over the past years.
Yeah.
Very well-intentioned people, but they are super busy, and you just need to push an issue to the point where they get the political pressure from the top saying, you've got to sort this out. And I think what the UK regulator in particular has done, against the backdrop of Brexit and the pandemic and the immense cuts that we've had to public services in the UK as well over a very long time period, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. But that also means that if the UK regulator can do it, well, I think you should be able to expect regulators in other countries to manage it as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we look at what happened with COVID-19 and how so many countries were suddenly interacting and how many regulators were talking to each other and entrepreneurs talking to each other, we see that it is doable. And obviously, World Health Organization, Declaration of Helsinki, it did give also a good framework on what has to be done. the question is, how does everything in parallel starts moving? Because we need the legal progress as well to create a new framework for data sharing, and then we need the transparency regulations within the pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies as well. And to me, it looks like it's more of a standardization issue as well, because if these are not standardized across different countries, then how do we move them in parallel? How do we, because every country has a different legal infrastructure, they have a different cultural infrastructure. And we did see that in the pandemic as well, like you mentioned, with Russia or China differing highly from US and UK perhaps, or the rest of EU. So how do you view that? How do you move in parallel into more global and more central transparency framework?
Well, I mean, that's clearly out of my pay grade, you know. I wouldn't know, but I think what we have seen is recently there was a meta-analysis published of convalescent blood plasma for COVID-19 treatment. Yeah. So it looked at all the available data from all clinical trials worldwide. 68% of that data, worldwide collected data on convalescent blood plasma, came from a single trial, which is the recovery trial in the UK. You know, corticosteroids, you know, who discovered that corticosteroids would reduce death of people hospitalized with COVID? Again, it was the recovery trial in the UK. You know, this is an example where you see excellence in clinical trial regulation and excellence in clinical trial coordination as well. You know, where you have one big national platform trial that just pulled together, you know, all the hospitals in the UK into one trial, how that can create really powerful evidence in a short time frame. If you look at COVID trials in Spain, for example, you know, they launched over 40 different COVID trials. You know, oh, this university did a hydroxychloroquine trial, you know, that pharma company did that, you know. He had, I think, over half of the trials in Spain were hydroxychloroquine trials, and they all used separate inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, outcome measures, doses, you know. Those trials were all research waste before they even started, you know, and they should never have been started. And I think that's something that, as a medical research community, we've definitely learned from the pandemic, that this sort of helter-skelter, uncoordinated approach to running clinical trials in a lot of settings simply doesn't make sense. The question is, have policymakers noticed that as well, you know? Are they going to now put frameworks in place where you can run when the next pandemic strikes, or even for things like, you know, there are plenty of medical problems out there where larger scale, better organized trials would
Yeah.
make a hell of a lot of difference to the evidence base. And then also, you know, the faster reporting of results. And that's something that really changed in the pandemic, where, you know, results were going up in preprints, etc. So if you've got a COVID patient who gets the results, I think with the corticosteroids from the recovery trial, the recovery trial just put out a basic info sheet saying, you know, these are our results. And the next day, the WHO changed its treatment guidelines for COVID, and worldwide, you know, hospitals started giving these corticosteroids to patients, you know. That was one day after the data analysis was completed. So with cancer trials, with malaria trials, with trials for high blood pressure, for depression, you know, Alzheimer's, why should patients have to wait 3 years until a medical journal comes along, you know? Can't we do that for trial registries? And like I said, the infrastructure is there, but you also need things like common outcome measures there, you know, inclusion, exclusion criteria. So ideally what we'd have in the future would be like a medical research system that actually makes sense. Because right now we don't have that. We got that on a national level in the UK, but I mean, where's the groundbreaking research on repurposed COVID drugs in the US? There hasn't been any. The US gave over 100,000 people convalescent plasma. We know today that that didn't generate any benefits. So US healthcare costs. How much did that cost? 100,000 people treated, with these transfusions. So let's say it cost like $1,000 per patient. That would be a bill of $100 million. If you assume that it costs 10,000 per patient, that would be, I mean, these are huge amounts of money that are being wasted on treatments where we don't know whether they work or not. And I think if we're looking for a way to save a lot of money and to save a lot of lives, then coming up with some sort of sane clinical trial regulation would really help. But how to make that happen politically?
It's a tricky one, and it's a this duplication is a waste for all stakeholders, and I think that's the kind of the awareness that has to be raised, that this problem is actually costing everyone a lot. And I think if that message goes out repeatedly in a more intensive way, and I think COVID-19 could be a good vehicle, right, to send that message, to showcase how important it is to tackle this problem. And hoping that also this interesting guide for policymakers that you wrote together with Crit and Cochrane will also, I'm sure, provide a good guideline for policymakers across the world. So we're entering the last 5 minutes, and I want to actually touch base to this document that we also shared in the chat, Clinical Trial Transparency Guide for Policymakers. Maybe Till, you can tell us a bit on, in the closing remarks, on the importance of this document that I have here, Guide for Policymakers. How did you construct it, and what do you plan to do with it in terms of sharing with different stakeholders? What the communication plan is with it, if you can share with us.
Yeah, I think this was published about 3 years ago, and it came together really. The idea was to pull together all the evidence that was out there, all the major evidence about, how the current system wasn't working particularly well in terms of transparency, and then also sketching out solutions and just coming up with a basic list of policy solutions, actionable policy solutions that policymakers could then immediately translate into what they want to do. So before that, we already had the All Trials campaign. And the All Trials campaign had one very clear message that they got everyone behind. They said all clinical trials registered and fully reported. And that's great. But what does fully reported mean? That is not from a policy, from a coalition building perspective, that's wonderful, because you can get, you got a great basic principle that everyone can agree on, you can get everyone together under that heading, to push for change. But then how do you actually translate that into practice? Registered when? What does fully reported mean? And I don't think this guide for policymakers is the last word in those things, but it just sort of sets out the basics, because I've seen again and again, I mean, you need to understand that especially politicians, rather than civil servants, if you get senior civil servants, they tend to be specialized in area. A member of parliament will get up in the morning and they'll deal with agricultural policy for the first half hour. For the next half hour, they're going to deal with domestic violence. The next hour is going to be like foreign policy towards Syria. And then there's going to be something about clinical trials for half an hour, They don't have time to go through the academic literature. They don't have time to, all these differences between, trial registries, and then there's clinical study reports, but there's also academic publications, and there's, all of this is like a really confusing landscape, and people don't have the time for it. So it was just to make it accessible, and it was a collaboration, like you said, with Cochrane, with Transparency International, and with Crit. And the idea was just to put out some sort of basic actionable guidelines that everyone can agree on. so that when we go forward in future, and we're already doing that, we just constantly refer back to that and say, this is like a shared agenda here. This is like, these are basic principles set out by the World Health Organization and by Helsinki, and this is how they should be translated and practiced. This is what we can all agree on. And that makes it much, much easier to, for example, when you got the question, what should the regulator in France do? You can just open that document and you can go, okay, these are like the three things that are relevant to the regulator. For example, academic publication isn't. Regulators stay out of that. But you can say, okay, we've got like the trial registration, the registries here, and we got the clinical study reports. And these are like the four things that regulators can and should do. And so it's just translating like a lot of academic and industry research just into language that is accessible for policymakers, and where a research assistant to a member of parliament or to a minister can look at it and they can go, okay, these are the basics here, and this is where the gaps are, and this is what we should be doing. And also to enable all organizations to just speak with one voice.
Yeah, great. It's definitely a very interesting document. I recommend everyone to read it. And I'm guessing that the feedbacks you received have been positive, right? In terms of how easy to grasp what it was saying, in terms of, because you constructed into 5 sections, and it was easy to, as you said, there's so much information, and instead of going through so many articles, it's a great summary. So thank you for this great work, Till, together with Cochrane, TI, and CRIT as well. So we're unfortunately run out of time. I can talk about this topic for hours.
I'm even worse.
Yeah, it's just so much to go through and so much to talk about. But I'm really happy that we had this session, and I really appreciate your time, Till, and being with us today, and sharing your experience and your expertise in clinical trial transparency, and also what TranspariMED is doing. So thank you so much, and we hope to have you soon again.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, and have a nice day. Cheers.
You too, Till. Have a great evening. Bye.
Bye.